Hello everyone, my name is Hunza and welcome back to our journey through Norse mythology. Our topic for today is no other than the wonderful and terrible goddess of love, sorcery, sex and fertility, the majestic lady of the slain and the fearsome queen of the Valkyries. I'm talking of course about no other than Freya. Or was it Frigg? First things first, we have to establish a distinction between Freya and Frigg, or the lack thereof. A very common theme in Norse mythology is that the gods often go by different names, a ploy they use most often as a disguise in some of their schemes. Odin is a clear example of that, as he quite frequently travels throughout the 9 worlds under the disguise of a simple wanderer, and under a variety of different names, thus encountering things and freely speaking to creatures and people that would otherwise shun, hide, or act violently if they knew that in reality it was the king of the gods they were facing. And to give you an idea of just how far Odin is willing to go to keep his identity hidden, there is actually a poem in which Odin reveals over 3 dozen names he used as a disguise on his journeys. And this behavior isn't uncommon for other gods as well. The best example, given today's topic, is from our last video about the Aesir-Vanir war, where Freya arrived to Asgard, introducing herself under a false name and a disguise as to not make the gods too suspicious of her true intentions. So now we know that gods often wore different names as masks to reach a certain goal they were pursuing. The correlation between Freya and Frigg, however, is far more complicated. To better understand it, we have to realize that the Old Norse religion as we know it today, with Thor and Odin and all the other gods, didn't come to being overnight, but gradually evolved just as any other religion, from common tribal gods in the area. In this case, it was the Proto-Germanic deities of the ancient era, namely these original deities which I am not even going to try to pronounce, who we today know as Odin, Thor and Tyr. Interesting thing to note here is that the god we today know as Tyr, the god of justice and war, seems to have been, in his original form, a deity of the sky as well as of war, and what is even more interesting is that it is also presumed he was the original chief of the Proto-Germanic gods as well as possibly their father. However, during the first millennium AD, the proto-deity that corresponds to our today's version of Tyr seems to have lost on popularity, and the gods we today know as Odin and Thor seem to have taken the mantle of the main gods in the pantheon of the Germanic peoples. But even without the migration of nations, the Proto-Germanic religion wasn't a one solidified belief. We could think of it as more of a framework, according to which each tribe, maybe even individual families, personalized their religion and worldview and its practices. This is why each tribe's perspective of their gods, while fundamentally similar, was still subjective, depending on individual tribe. Later, however, during the migration of nations, and more importantly after it ended, the many tribes that may have traveled together and settled around the same area, in time solidified their individual views into a more cohesive narrative that was then accepted and used throughout the newly established kingdoms and nations these tribes made for themselves. For example, while in 5th century AD, among the Danish tribes we may have encountered Thor and Odin, among the Anglo-Saxon tribes you'd see Thunor and Woden, while among the Franks you would find Dunor and Woden, the Alfadir. And just as the culture and dialects of these different peoples evolved over time, their religion and gods also went through changes, and that's why some gods may have different names from what we are used to from Norse mythology, as well as slightly different attributes, while the core structure of the pantheon remains the same. And the same could be said about Freya. The Vanir goddess we know today is derived from a common Proto-Germanic mother goddess of sex and fertility called Freya. During the Viking Age, Freya was the most popularly worshipped goddess among the people practicing Germanic paganism. Even though it was common for individual holds, towns, even villages to have their own fertility goddess, mostly passed down from local tradition, the worship of Freya still held higher popularity over the regional goddesses. When it came to sacrifices dealing with fertility, blessing the harvest for example, the local goddesses were usually still referred to as Freya, as they were, in the end, thought of as a personification of the goddess, merely one of her many embodiments. Now that we laid the groundwork for Freya, where does Frigg come into the picture? Well, from what we know today, Frigg is not but a mere duplication of Freya, as their resemblance is uncanny. Both goddesses have Odin as their husband, although be it under a different name. Both are practitioners of Seder and can foresee the future. Both own a cloak of falcon feathers that allows one to transform into the said bird. Both are goddesses of fertility. Both are, well, for lack of better words, exceptionally lustful. They are both noted to have slept with Odin's brothers, as well as a variety of others. They both hold a liking to jewelry, and I think I've made my point. The small number of things they don't have in common, like their halls in Asgard and their fathers, are vastly overshadowed by the sheer quantity of things they share that are completely identical for both of them. This, however, cannot be a mistake of translation or mere coincidence. In the Norse poems we have, that serve as our primary source of Norse myths, both Freya and Frigg are referred to, mentioned, and interacted with distinctly, both even being in the room with one another at one point. It is clear now that this isn't some scholarly mistake, nor was it the fault of the poets or someone who wrote their poems down. However, the question remains, why? Why was this goddess split into two seemingly same characters within the myths? I think the best explanation is given to us by Daniel McCoy in his book The Viking Spirit. Quote, "The separation of this one goddess into two probably began late in the Viking Age, and was never completed because it was interrupted by the acceptance of Christianity. The next question, of course, is, why was Freya, Frigg, being split into two goddesses? We simply don't know." End quote. The last sentence of this quote perfectly summarizes that when we are facing something we don't have the necessary information and evidence to prove and explain, there is no shame in admitting we don't know. And so it is with everything. I won't make any wild claims as why this split of one goddess into two occurred, for there is simply not enough information to go on, to make even a speculation. A good thing to take away from this is that myths, just as anything else, evolve over time. To quote Daniel McCoy once more, myth is eternal, but it never stops changing. And so this concludes the first part of the video explaining the necessary distinction between the two goddesses. But before we move on, I want to make one thing clear. I am no expert on Norse mythology, but I read a lot and I know a good deal of things about it, and I'm happy to share that with whomever is willing to listen. However, even though I want to remain as close to the sources as possible and bring you all the possible information about the topic we are discussing, I want to mainly focus on the storytelling aspect of my videos. I will always inform you about the topic at hand to the best of my abilities, but don't be alarmed if you notice some inconsistencies later on, as something that doesn't really fit my narrative may be changed up a bit for the sake of storytelling. Everyone pictures the myths and characters a bit differently, based on their personal preferences, viewpoints, and most of all, imagination. In my videos, I present to you the world and stories of Norse myths as I see them, and I may customize some stories and characters to fit my own comprehension and imagination. Basically, if I decide to change, add or remove something, you can always be sure it's because I want to make the overall story around it more fun, cool, and better organized. And why I'm even telling you all this is because in my view of Norse myths, Freya and Frigg are one character. I recognize that in the sources they are not, but for the sake of storytelling and cohesion, my version of the Norse myths will have Freya filling both her and Frigg's role. You don't need to worry, this won't be a problem later on, as any role Frigg has in the myths can be easily replaced by Freya with barely any difference. That just shows how similar the two characters are. Now with all that out of the way, let's talk about Freya. Very well then, let's first discuss the family ties of both Freya and Frigg, respectively. Frigg is said to be the daughter of Fjorgwyn and the sister of Fulla, though neither of these two is mentioned again in any of the Norse myths other than in their relation to Frigg. Freya, on the other hand, is the daughter of Njord, the Vanir god of the sea, and the sister of Frey, the Vanir god of wealth and fertility, although her mother is a figure unknown to us. Frigg's husband is Odin, and Freya's husband is called Other. If you think this name bears a striking resemblance to Odin, you would be correct, as Other is but an earlier version of Odin from the migration period, which after its end slowly changed to the god we today know as Odin. The only thing we know about Other further reveals his character to be identical with Odin's, that being that Other is seldom in Asgard, as he spends almost all the time travelling away from home, leaving Freya alone. The sad goddess then cries tears of red gold over her husband's absence, which fall down to Midgard, and we can find them as nuggets of gold. Freya doesn't just sit idly, however, and oftentimes ventures out into the Nine Worlds in search of her husband, riding her cat-driven chariot. Unfortunately, she is on a fool's errand, as her husband travels far and wide, and more often than not under a disguise, and so her searches always end with her returning home the same way she left, alone. Now, this howbeit simple description of Other is quite fitting in the description of Odin, who, as we all know, quite often travelled throughout the Nine Worlds seeking knowledge and wisdom untold. And putting on a disguise was common practice for him. I mean, one of his most popular disguises in Gangleri, the Wanderer, when Odin would put on a disguise of an old man walking with a staff, draped in a grey cloak and a pointy hat. Fun fact, this version of Odin was used by J.R.R. Tolkien in creation of Gandalf the Grey in The Hobbit. Well, to get back on our topic, it is quite obvious that, in essence, Other and Odin are one and the same. Furthermore, Frigg's children she had with Odin were Balder, the Shining One, and Hod, sometimes called Hodr, a god we know very little about aside from his very infamous role in bringing about the events of Ragnarok, but that's a topic that is still far away for us. The children of Freya and Odin, or Other, are only mentioned in name without any attributes nor further information about them. There was a daughter, Hnoss, meaning jewel, and a son, Gemesi, meaning treasure. The names of these children are quite fitting, as Freya's love for precious jewels and material wealth seemed at times even greater than that for her husband. One story of Freya tells us just how far she was willing to go for her lust for gold and beauty. This is the story of how she obtained her wondrous golden necklace, Brisingamen. Once upon a time, Freya was taking a stroll through the forest when she heard strange noises and commotion coming from a large boulder nearby. Freya neared closer and peered in, only to find that the boulder was a home to a group of 4 dwarf smiths who were working on a beautiful golden necklace. The moment Freya set her eyes on the necklace, she knew she couldn't live without it. She crawled into the boulder and tried to bargain with the dwarfs, promising them riches of gold and silver beyond measure if they would give her the necklace in return. The dwarves, however, were no short of riches of their own, and any of Freya's pleas were in vain. The goddess was desperate, but determined to have the necklace for herself, and so she asked the dwarfs what would they ask of her in exchange for the necklace. The dwarfs smirked and nodded to each other knowingly, and told the goddess that they would happily give her the necklace if she would lay with each of them for a night. Freya was disgusted by the proposition, repulsed by the dirty and crooked look of the dwarfs, but nevertheless she was set to have what she desired, and so she agreed, and 4 nights she spent with the dwarfs inside their boulder, until she finally emerged on the 5th day with the golden necklace draped above her breasts. However, Loki, the mischievous creature he was, recognized the necklace on first sight, as there was not one like it in the whole cosmos, and he quickly set out to the dwarves that forged it to find out just how did Freya obtain it from them. Upon finding out what Freya gave the smiths in return, he promptly found Odin and told him about Freya's doing. The enraged Allfather had to do all he could to restrain himself, and finally he ordered Loki to steal the necklace and bring it to him. Loki did just that, and in the night he changed into the shape of a fly and slipped under the locked door of Freya's room. He then changed into his normal form and quietly removed the necklace from around Freya's neck, and unlocking the door from the inside, he slipped away and ran to Odin with his prize. The next day, Freya woke only to find out her precious necklace was missing, and furiously she stormed to Odin to tell him that someone stole something very valuable to her, and that the culprit had to be found immediately. Odin then reached inside his robe, and pulling out the necklace, he asked if this might be the object she so desired. Freya's rage reached its peak just then and there, and she accused Odin of being nothing but a shameful thief. At that moment, Odin ran out of patience and asked Freya quite plainly if his theft was just as shameful as having an affair with 4 other men, dwarfs to boot. Freya froze, shocked by Odin's knowledge of what she had done, and with a somber voice she apologized and asked if she could have her necklace back. Odin, however, told her he would hold on to the necklace until she would do something for him in return. He asked of Freya to stir up a war between 2 kingdoms so that the fallen would help him fill the halls of Valhalla. And without hesitation, Freya set out to do just that, and in a few days' time, armies of thousands of warriors clashed upon the battlefield in a war that would claim many lives until its end. But that felt like a distant memory to Freya, and she had finally gained her necklace back and wore it happily from that day on. This only shows us how lustful and downright greedy of wealth and jewels Freya was. Freya didn't lust only for jewels, however, as sex and pleasures of the flesh were another thing she sought out quite eagerly. And not just with her husband. Both Freya and Frigg are noted to quite often mingle with all manner of characters in Norse mythology, not excluding slaves, elves, both Odin's brothers, and even Freya's own brother, Frey. It was no wonder, however, that Freya could seduce whomever she wished, as her beauty and charm was famed throughout the cosmos. So much so that even giants wanted to claim Freya as their wife, and several stories deal with Freya as a part of some bargain between gods and giants. Be warned though, Freya is not one that could not take care of herself. Her skill in Seder allow her to hold sway over both her fate and that of others, if she so chooses. She was also hailed as the Queen of the Valkyries, the warrior maidens that pick and carry the fallen from the battlefield to Valhalla. And perhaps not just there. There's a small mention in Odin's account of the halls in Asgard about the nature of Freya's dwelling place. Quote, "The 9th is Folkwang, where Freya decrees who shall have seats in her hall. Half of the slain are hers each day, and half are Odin's own." End quote. This seems to suggest that Freya's hall is akin to Valhalla, as she herself takes part of the fallen dead into her domain. However, this claim is not backed by any additional information from the old sources we have, and nowhere else is Freya mentioned in a connection with the afterlife. Quite frankly, this information should be taken with more than just a grain of salt, and I suggest you think of it as but an interesting piece of myths to speculate about, rather than a concrete fact. After all, our knowledge of the Norse myths is still far from satisfactory, as quite a good amount of them is lost to the ages, and we only know of places such as Valhalla and Asgard, and gods such as Odin and Thor, because they held such a high prominence with the Norse society, culture, and myths. There are many gods, places, and beings about which we know nothing more than a name or a sentence, and sometimes not even that, just because they may have not been so prominent as the places, gods and beings we know from the Norse myths today. And Freya's Hall could easily be one of those things. But there is no telling today. Perhaps Freya's Hall served as the place where shield maidens and other female warriors went after they died. The expression, half of the slain are hers each day, could support that, as it is well known that women in Scandinavia during the Viking Age took part in battles and raids as much as the men, so the term half of the slain could mean that Freya literally takes only the members of the female gender into her hall. Or perhaps Freya and Odin agreed to split the bravely fallen heroes, so that they could both better prepare for the final battle at Ragnarok. As I said, this is all in the realm of speculation, and nothing but hypotheses can be made about the nature of Freya's Hall. Now let's move on to the magical artifacts and assets Freya possesses. I already mentioned Freya's cat-driven chariot, which she used as a method of transportation, and she also had a boar, Hildisvini, who filled the same role. But there was yet another way Freya could travel through the worlds. Freya owned a cloak of falcon feathers which allowed her to transform into the said bird, and in the myths this piece of enchanted clothing helped the gods from bad situations more than enough times. We also mentioned Freya's necklace, Brisingamen, but what I didn't mention is that this necklace had the power to make anyone who wore it irresistibly beautiful. As if Freya really needed an enchanted piece of jewelry to achieve that, eh? Freya was as beautiful as she was fierce, a powerful sorceress and a lustful woman, with a deep love for gold and jewels that was only overshadowed by the love for her husband, whom she missed more than all the riches in the 9 worlds whenever he was not by her side. And once, Freya's love for Odin was to be put to a test, as at one time, the unquestioned ruler of Asgard we know today was banished from the Golden Realm and became not more but a wanderer. But this would be all for today, and I bid you all farewell until next time.